I'm really glad you can make it, you know. I'm sorry we didn't get that film, but maybe on another occasion we could let people see that. It was apparently really powerful. And it's a disgrace, you know, that children. We'll have a lot to talk about, and I'm really looking forward to this. And I hope you can get back to the UN to make your point. Welcome very much to Conversations. It's a pleasure to welcome to the program two gentlemen that we're going to be talking about a number of issues, perhaps, and particularly focusing on the situation regarding armed conflict and children that is been highlighted in a film that has been produced recently and shown at the UN and on HBO, I guess. But let me introduce the guests, and we'll get into a conversation. And if I may, on my far left is John German. John German's been a guest in the past, and he's the president, I guess, of the entity called Nonprofit Computing. And he also, if I may just parenthetically say, he has a very wide-ranging interest in a lot of these social justice issues and so forth, so prevalently needful of conversation in this particular time. And John, welcome very much to Conversations.
Good to be here again.
On my immediate left is Henrik Haggstrom, and he is with, if I may, let me get the whole title. I have to read it because it's pretty involved. It's the Office of the Special Representative of the Secretary General of the UN for Children in Armed Conflict. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And Henrik, welcome really very much to Conversation Manhattan Network.
Thank you.
Maybe you could share with us a little of your background, if you would. I understand you hail from Sweden originally, but could you share a little of your own background? Then we'll get into a conversation, particularly around this children soldier issues, which is really an amazingly difficult situation in the world.
Well, I'm pretty new with the United Nations. I haven't only been around for a while, but I spent a lot of years and a lot of time with NGOs working on children in armed conflict at field level and at policy level as well. In particular with Save the Children, which is an international NGO with member organizations in the US, but also in sort of Europe and in other places. And I'm from Sweden myself originally. In my sort of last 10 years or so, I've been involved in what we call demobilization programs, which is releasing children out of armed forces, armed groups. They could be, they can be non-state actors in terms of guerrilla armies or guerrilla groups or just regular armed forces. I also been involved in rehabilitation programs and reintegration programs of these children in countries like Sudan, northern Uganda, Ethiopia, Eritrea, the Middle East. I worked for a couple of years in Palestine, West Bank, Gaza, with the situation of the Palestinian children, and I suffered from the Intifada. But also been around and had all different kinds of duties in Mozambique as well, and so on. So that at sort of program field level, but then also heavily involved at global level to push for stronger protection on children in armed conflict, and in particular raising international legal standards and minimum age from 15 to 18 years, so that you have to be 18 years nowadays to actually participate in war or armed conflict situations. So I set up an international coalition called the International Coalition to Stop the Use of Child Soldiers, and we've been going on for years campaigning, lobbying on countries and governments and the United Nations and others to sort of accept the fact that 18 has to be a minimum age for children participating in armed conflict.
For combatants.
For combatants,
That's right. Is this is violate? What's the degree of the violation of that principle, that it be men that are involved and not children?
Well,
not to mention the gender issue begins to come into play, perhaps, But
I mean, the situation on the ground today is terrible. I mean, I think it's fair to say that we have. If you just take up the issue of child soldiering, for example, children participating as combatants, there are 300,000 of them today out there sort of being involved in combat. Of course, that number is not fixed, because the children die, and some of them get adults, and then there are new recruits sort of filling the ranks, so to speak. But I mean, that phenomena in itself is probably one of the sort of worst things that we see, because the way these children are treated are really, really bad, and we can come back to that, and what can be done about it. But of course, there's also other issues. I mean, they are basically what they say is that there are sort of 4 or 5 million children every year that are physically disabled because of wars, and that could be everything from landmines to, you know, sexual abuses or whatever or rifle fire or whatever. 10-12 million children approximately suffers from severe traumas, psychological problems related to armed conflict situations. So obviously the situation is problematic, and there are many components to this. I as an example, when I've been traveling around, I spent a lot of time negotiating with guerrilla movements and armed groups like this, to have them stop recruiting children and to demobilizing them. One of the worst situations, just to give an example of what it could look like, is northern Uganda. Northern Uganda has a conflict situation run by an organization or a guerrilla movement called the Lord's Resistance Army. The Lord's Resistance Army is managed by an individual called Joseph Kony. Joseph Kony is a bizarre character in many different ways. He believes in a number of religions that he sort of melted together, and he doesn't think that he can be killed, and he doesn't think that his soldiers can be killed, etc. However, what he has done is that during the last 10 years or so, he has abducted 10 to up to 20,000 kids forcibly in northern Uganda, took them back to southern Sudan, where he has his posting, and forcing them to combat with the boys mainly, and the girls he forces them into concubines or sex slaves, if you will, for their troops.
Good God.
So you have a situation...
He's based in the Sudan?
He's based in the southern Sudan. So you have a situation that if you travel in some of these villages, in Gulu, for example, or other places, in northern Uganda...
And you've been there, you've done duty there. You were in Ethiopia, you were stationed for a while too. Anyway, if you travel in northern Uganda, you will see that the people in these villages quite often lacks ears, lips, or noses. And this is all to the fact that this Joseph Kony and the Lord's Resistance Army has a special tactic. And the special tactic is that whenever they go in to a village, and the village doesn't approve necessarily of the politics of Joseph Kony, he cuts off exactly the ears, the noses, and the lips. And it's the children that was abducted in the first place that are forced to do this, often under gun threat. Good grief almighty, what a horror story.
So that is one example, and several of these kids have been able to escape and sort of gave us testimonies about what they have gone through, and that's when we come in, that's when the NGOs came in, when I was an NGO representative.
And you were an NGO with the Save the Children, right? And that's a major institution, and it's been around for a long time. Is this issue with children in terms of armed conflict getting worse, better through time? What's the trending? And when did the Save the Children get started in addressing this particular issue?
Save the Children has been around since 1919, so it's so the organization as such has been around a while. And working with situations in armed conflict has been the thrust or one of the key program activities for us for 50 years, perhaps, or something like this. So we are...
So this has long roots.
Yeah, I mean, we've been working with I'm sorry, I keep saying we. Of course, it's the NGOs, the bunch of people, the NGOs, and the UN, United Nations for that matter, which I, of course, represent in this particular... in this case. But I mean, those agencies have been around for a long time. and work with these issues. And what we can see as a collective knowledge is that the situation, in fact, is getting worse.
Getting worse.
Yeah,
Good
in terms
grief.
of the use of child soldiers. And they always used children. But it's getting worse because of a number of reasons. One of them being very technical, and it's about carrying and using guns. Today you have automatic rifles and automatic sort of guns, machine guns and light weapons that you can use even though you're a 7-year-old boy or 8 or 10.
Or something, or
Yeah, or even smaller, or
They
even
made
smaller.
yeah.
AK-47s, for example.
AK-47, right.
And you can get an AK-47 in Sierra Leone. You could during the war for a few dollars. I mean, it wasn't very expensive, and they're
Right.
easy to use, and
Any kid could use it.
any kid could use
Yeah,
them, and
right,
you can
right,
basically be quite effective by spraying, all these bullets out.
Yeah.
So that's one reason, and another reason that keeps coming up is that I think the type of warfare that we've experienced during the last, say, 2 decades or so
Okay.
have dramatically changed in the sense that in the good old days, if I use that expression, it was more common that states went into war with other nations and other states. So it was a country with another country. The absolute majorities of today's conflicts are not like that anymore. The 90% of them are all about conflicts within a country.
Yeah.
And this means that conflicts take place in the backyard of normal people's lives, because it's neighbors against neighbors, it's
Clan against
clan,
right,
groups against groups, and all of this.
That's really important.
And that has changed sort of the recruitment possibilities, because the children are sort of basically living on the battlefield, and it's very easy to get access to them.
Yeah.
And so that's one issue. Another issue, another reason for all of this is that in prolonged conflicts in particular, where fighting's been ongoing for say 10 years or 20 years, the adults tend to die out because of the war, and they need to fresh up with new recruits, and so children are there. Children are living in the immediate surroundings, so that makes it also easier for them to.
I wonder if I could ask a question about that war, and that's something you said, because clan identities, tribe identities, these kind of things have been there all along, and they've been a thing that really by which people get a sense of identity, and yet the wars have been tended to be, seen as a nation state fighting nation state, and the nation state had a firm political control over the people, as opposed to these sub-national identities, which have been, in terms of the people themselves, very consistently important in terms of the way they really see themselves. What has changed that has made that to emerge, as it were, instead of the war-making taking place between well-identified nation states and so forth in this last 20 years, as you said? Do you think it may be too large a question to get your eye?
It is it's a large question, but I mean,
it's
I think
very relevant to understanding
of course it is. But I think there are some, and it's an extremely interesting question, because it does require some elaborate answering. But what I think is that we've seen several trends, parallel trends, sort of during the last 1 or 2 decades. One of them has been sort of that already after the superpowers, after around 1989, 1990s, we had implosions of a number of nations that just collapsed because they had been upheld by the existing structure, the existing regime of that time.
Major one being Soviet Union. That's been a major tectonic movement.
And the Soviet Union and the US both sort of supported, a number of states out there in the world, and the situation changed slightly. And I think that was one of the reasons to why several countries ended up into these difficult situations. They lost control over their own territories. But it wasn't only that. It was also the sort of many of the European countries pulled out of Africa in the 50s because
that was the decolonization. After the Second World War.
So that would be one sort of set of explanations, I think. But there are also other reasons.
That's a big issue.
It's an enormous issue in itself, of course.
I did a doctorate dissertation on in South America about Bolivia and that, and I had occasion to study prehistory, and there had been a civilization, Tiwanaku, that had held sway all the way from Lake Titicaca in Bolivia up to Venezuela over the long haul, and then they went into decline, and it was a couple of 100 years or so before the Spaniards came, but the tribal units that were there that they had held sway over were rose up then because the imperial control was not able to assert it. So I think that's a part of history's unfolding and that sort of thing. So you had the Inca came from Huari and Cusco 100 years before the Spaniards came. The Soviet Union's fallen apart. The bipolar view of the world has fallen apart, so that we now have, as they will say in France and so forth, one really super duper hyper power, the United States of America, is the fact that these ethnic entities are exerting themselves effectively outside of a controllable nation state context in which power can assert itself effectively, reflect the fact that this now hyper power United States and maybe Europe or the trilateral nations or something are not able to effectively assert their power? Or why is it that it's emerging now?
I think it's. If
you understand what I'm saying, a large historical
I'm understanding what you're
unfolding.
saying, but what I think has happened is that since the 50s, something like, around that time, the world, as we saw it then, was radically shook up by a number of changes. Decolonization was one of them. That was huge.
Thing blowing in the wind.
And then we had sort of the Cold War that sort of fell apart with all its structures.
Yes.
And what we see now, but this is my own sort of
Okay,
interpretation
but
you
you talk to your colleagues
exactly,
in the field.
But this is, and we see the aftermath of that. There are countries struggling with resources or lack of resources, for example. There are countries struggling with keeping up, having control over the nation, etc. And of course, these are very important factors when you want to understand or explain why conflicts like this emerge within nations, within states and countries.
That's right. Well, John, you're the one who told me about that film. I guess that really made an impression on you. We don't have a clip here to show, but there was a film about children soldiers.
I'd like to pick up on some.
Take it.
I'd like to pick up on some of the threads that you've been spinning out here. One of them is about colonialization. That in the time of setting up when the colonial powers came into many of these countries, the nation state, for I think most Americans, is something which is like a fixed star. It's part of the firmament God created or something. It's kind of a given. It's like the furniture. Of course, we have nation states.
Years old.
Well, and many of them much less than that. I mean, some of the nation states that have conflicts that now involve child soldiers were really colonial creations. And many of them were frankly gerrymandered by the colonial powers in order to be able to control the situation. The old
like Tom DeLay's doing in Texas.
Well, the old British ideal of divide and rule, divide and conquer.
That was the British,
Right, who developed that and implemented it brilliantly in many countries. And we're looking at countries on the map today that for Americans are kind of a given. And you look at it and say, country, what's a country about this thing except that some colonial power said, these are where we're going to put the boundaries, and we're purposely putting these warring ethnic groups into one pot so that they'll fight each other, and they'll keep each other so busy that we can rule and basically take the benefit from the extractive industries of their wealth. And this is both the blessing and the curse of many of these countries, that they have fabulous natural wealth that has been mined by extractive industries for, at this point, over a century in many places. And so many places where there are child soldiers, you're looking at a country where basically the wealth of the country has been taken by first colonial powers and then by economic interests, which now get mixed up, as we see in the daily papers, with really a kind of a private militia approach to keeping control. So
along ethnic lines, maybe, along those lines.
And using ethnic conflict in order to assert control for economic advantage, which is basically continuing to rape the country of its natural resources or the benefit of them by not industrializing. Take Bolivia, the thing that just toppled the president.
The president had to step down,
Right, because the people, broad factions of the political elite and the people of the country recognized that exporting the natural resource in its natural state was a bad idea from an economic standpoint because it wasn't industrialized, they didn't add value, and the resource was just going to leave the country, and they would never have a chance to better the economic state of the country. The only way to do that is to industrialize the product within the country and export the industrialized product at much higher prices.
Like China's doing.
Right, and this is, take Africa as a continent, you can look at many things from diamonds to the mining industries for all kinds of metals throughout
They have
Africa.
a huge resource base, I believe, don't they, in Africa? Yeah.
Right.
Oh,
Yeah.
of all kinds.
Yeah,
I mean,
of all kinds, yeah.
Right.
That's
Even oil exporting
Yeah,
countries,
right.
you can look at the same dynamic.
Yeah.
If they don't industrialize what they're producing, then it produces cash flow until it stops, and when it's over, what have they gained?
You haven't got an infrastructure that you can
Right.
build upon.
So
in
you
a
couple
modern
this
way,
with the idea that at this point the nation state has essentially lost the cartel approach to the control of what would you call it? There's a
political power.
phrase for this, the projection of power.
Raison d'etre.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
The American military term would be the ability to project power. Well, the ability to project power at this point is in the hands of somebody who can hoist a shoulder-fired missile, for example, and bring down a commercial airliner.
Now it can do
can
that,
be.
and it's happening. Yeah,
Right.
right.
So essentially,
And this is emerging as Henrik says in the last 20 years or
Right,
so, in
small arms
particular
and-
observable proportion.
right, and small arms and light weapons,
Yeah.
which make it possible to recruit children, and so that you can have this decline of the nation state, the loss of control over the means of projection of military power, the ability for all those ethnic groups that were bottled up in artificially created nation states suddenly looking around and saying, we don't have to put up with this anymore. And so there they are now with the ability to project power. And the child soldier could also, you might want to have a different view on this, but it would also look from a certain standpoint like a weapon of the weak, W-E-A-K, of the weak.
Yeah,
Just like terrorism.
Yeah.
Like terrorism.
Right.
Whereas someone brilliantly put it in the video that sparked this whole thing a few weeks ago, that when you can't convince adults of the rightness of your cause and get them so worked up that they will fight for your cause, well, you can always go recruit a bunch of kids.
Because they're easy to mold their minds and so forth. Hitler
Yeah,
said, give me the kids until they're 10, I'll have them for life or something.
Well,
if you educate them
but it's worse than
in
that.
propagandistic ways.
One of the things that we really need to do is to start using different vocabulary for talking about child soldiers. When people talk about recruiting, let me give you a West African example, and I don't want to pin down a country because it's happened in several. The idea of recruiting child soldiers during a period of time, at least in West Africa, was based on the idea that a guerrilla group would come into a village, essentially grab a bunch of kids, put a small arm, a light weapon in their hands, and say, kill your parents. If they didn't do it, they immediately kill the kid and hand the weapon to the next kid.
Good grief.
Now, until somebody figured, well, I don't want to die, so blam, blam, the parents are gone. Okay, now the kid's an orphan, standing there with his life totally in chaos. They grab the kid, take him off, drug him, and put him to work as a soldier. Is that recruiting? I don't think so. I don't think that that's a term.
And that happens? Does that happen in your experience?
Oh yeah, for sure.
Is that grim, that ugly, that Dickensian?
Worse than that.
I mean, yeah.
William Blake even kind of.
It's like I told you about the situation in northern Uganda, which is exactly the same thing. No, for sure. I mean, the forcible recruitment, the abductions for recruitment.
Of the most vulnerable.
Our children at the age of 7, 8, 9, 10 are extremely common. I mean, I would say that maybe, I don't know, 30–40% of the recruitments going on are of that kind, of that nature.
I want you to keep with the flow of your thought and everything, but it could also apply to, let's say, who traditionally women have not been involved. Will they be recruiting women to pick up a gun and put the same kind of pressures and press them into action, or is it still a matter of testosterone-laden males?
You have well, women to some extent, not so much. What's interesting though, that
Maybe
in
they're
some
missing an
cultures,
opportunity there?
but in some cultures they use girls,
No.
sort of girl soldiers.
But a girl can fire an AK-47.
Yeah, and they do this, and they do it, for example, in Sri Lanka. The Tamil Tigers are known for using girls, for example. There are several other countries, but it's not that common, which is important to say. However, coming back to this whole issue of child soldiers, I think it's interesting to discuss to all these people who actually do recruit them, because when you have conversations with them and you say, you know, why are you doing this?
Yeah, what is in your mind?
What's, you know, how could you possibly and do, you know,
They,
do this? What's the rationale and what's the purpose?
They must get off into things about it's an absolute evil we're confronting or something. Am I wrong or wrong? Are they saying that we must marshal everything against this
I mean, for them, it's
what did they
for them it's very practical. I mean, they refer to things like they're easy, you know, they're easier to indoctrinate, for example. They eat less. They obey order in ways that an adult wouldn't do. You can, for example, if you shoot them with a special drug that they're used in Africa, it's gunpowder. It's gunpowder, milk, and acid, or sort of drugs that take you up. That they mix into glass and they drink it, and then of course they you know, you're basically able to ask them to do anything. And one of the things you do is that you line them up on a minefield, and then you have them walk over the minefield
to find the mines,
to clear the minefield.
Good grief.
So you know, the mines go off, you know,
Well,
and then they just continue. And that's one thing. And the other thing that they use kids for are for espionage. They say it's a great thing to send in a 10-year-old
because he won't be suspect.
No one will suspect that he's actually from, you know, a soldier. It's
they
all
had those in the Iran-Iraq War, human waves. Or
yeah,
they had in Korea
exactly.
also, human
in Iran.
waves. They would just send human waves against overpowering, you know, powerful firepower and so forth. It's a horror. I mean, really an awful horror.
But of course, coming from my point of view, being a United Nations person and previously an NGO person, I think the big question and the big challenge is, how do we make a difference? How do we? Is it even possible to change all
Save
this?
the Children been trying since 1919, as you say. Right?
Yeah,
and you say the situation is in
Nation
certain qualitative ways getting worse.
In certain qualitative ways,
of the political states that had held sway for a couple hundred years.
I mean, it goes.
And do you see that getting worse as the if the nation state, which has been the means of having political control, and we got 189 states over 91 over the UN now, those are the countries of the world, and if those are less and less reflective of a reality that's emerging in terms of this ethnic diversity diverging out and so on, is the situation likely to get worse? And do the intensity of the feelings that are involved with war or throwing a human horde against an evil other, and we hear the word evil used a lot, even by our major leaders like Mr. Bush, who use words like evil, and so you get into an absolute situation where it's an existential absolute threat to get this evil that and so forth. Are the trends bad in terms of, if we look ahead, let's say I just got my granddaughter I saw this weekend, and I wonder, is it going to be worse for her as we get into 10, 20, 30 years out, or what do you think?
I think it depends on a lot of things. It depends on I mean, there are issues which relate to economics, for example, and development in Africa, economic and political development in Asia and South America, and if there will be some stability there. But it also relates to the international response to these issues, and to what extent we can become more effective than we have been, and to what extent our response is actually has learned from experiences from the past and good practice and so on. And it's my absolute belief that there is a possibility to make a difference if you do run programs well. And let me take you one example of a situation where a difference actually has been made, and it's Sudan again. In Southern Sudan and Northern Sudan has been in war since the 50s, basically.
You have an Islamic Christian thing, or animist thing?
Yeah. There's the Christians sort of in the south, and then you have
right?
Exactly, and then you have the Muslims in the north. Even though it's slightly mixed, but still, but that's basically what the conflict is about, and oil, of course. But I've been there several times, and had lots of discussions with the SPLA guerrilla, for example, which is the movement there. The Sudan's People Liberation Army is what it stands for. and they are the only guerrilla movement that we know of today that have actually agreed not to stop recruiting children under the age of 18.
That's encouraging, perhaps. Huh?
And not only have they agreed, but at least where they can control the situation, they have in fact stopped. And there are thousands of kids that have been demobilized over the last 5 years or so. Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
Right.
Even though it's also true that recruitment is ongoing in sort of the outskirts of southern Sudan and even northern Sudan, but nevertheless, I mean, it has stopped. And the big question is, of course, why did it stop? Because we have a similar, we have the Tamil Tigers who made similar commitments in '97 in Sri Lanka. We have the ELN guerrilla in Colombia who also made similar, FARC guerrilla, who also made similar commitments. But they were violated sort of a day after the commitments were made.
FARC is in
Colombia.
I know that, but are they taking children? Are they using children in that war in Colombia?
Oh, for sure.
Good God.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
Never
And on the
nevertheless,
what do you call it, the other side, the right-wing side, they have a force in Colombia. I guess it's often that case where they have it's called, you have the guerrilla movement FARC, and then you have another thing. They're like
ELN.
ELN? Is that
ELN?
But they're people that are defending of the right wing. Let's say, in a certain sense, you know?
yeah.
So you have it on both sides politically.
Oh, you have it on both sides politically.
And there's there's violations on both sides.
But coming back to Sudan,
please,
I mean, I'm just saying. So one of the times when I was there and we had a discussion, I said, "Why have you stopped this? I mean, what made you do it?" And they basically said, "Well,
what did they say?
There's a couple of things they said. One of them is that we've discovered that if we sign up on international treaties and conventions and international legislation, we get political credit internationally. We get goodwill from not only from countries but also from media. We get CNN to say we're good. We get BBC to say we're good. We get other sort of international media to tell the world that we're doing this. And for them, it's an extremely pragmatic reason, but an important one, of course, because they need that support in their situation.
Why have I not seen a report on the news to that effect? I can't recall
good
ever
news.
seeing that.
When did you see good news?
No, that's an interesting thing. You know, but you know, I mean, if there were the terror stories, that's reported.
Yeah, but obviously, this is something you want to know. How could you replicate this with other groups? How could they be convinced to see it this way? Should we be paying to take some of the leaders from Sudan to other countries to say, look, this is why we did it. I did it. This is why I did it.
We did exactly that in Mozambique in 1999.
Couldn't there be a place in the media for these kind of things to be able to be part of what is put before people's consciousness? You know, if there's example, do you understand what I'm saying? It's a large issue. I know John's very interested in that.
But I'm very interested
many issues there are in the world.
In the voice of peers, peer to peer, that if a leader of that guerrilla group from Sudan were to go and be introduced to the leaders of other guerrilla groups and say, look, like you, I'm fighting, they would find similarities, they'd find common ground, and they would establish that bond and then say, okay, this is why I did this, and here is how it has worked out for me, for us, for our movement. I think that could be quite compelling.
Yeah, I got 10 minutes on CNN, you know, and we got a lot because of that, and it's a pragmatic level.
Whatever the real story is.
But and then are the realities of the world, you said something when you were talking about you studied economics, both of you and so forth. Are the economic conditions that exist, Tip O'Neill one time, I don't know if you're familiar with our local, he was a fellow here in a poll in the United States, he said all politics is local. This is a famous saying that goes around now. In a certain sense, all politics is economic. If you get down to it, it gets down to economic conditions. If all the world were in a happy economic situation, probably a good deal of the conflict, whatever the ethnic cover story is or something like that, it gets down to that. Is there any hope that we're going to be able to find some sort of an economically just world order? Mr. Stiglitz and Mr. Sachs up at Columbia, they tell us the IMF, the situation that's in place right now is not serving well only but the top 20% of the world, and that the bottom people are being not advantaged, and that the institutions that are legitimately in place now are not adequate to meet the needs of the masses of the people of the world, it's only going to get worse for them. So if it does, then you're going to have a context within which, as Mao said, the fish swims in the water of discontent. And what do you think on that vein? Do you think
before I come to that, let me just finish their argument, because that was just one point of this.
Okay.
But there were also two other arguments that were pretty strong.
We're talking about the Sudan.
The Sudan again, before I come into that, because I'm just saying that the one was the sort of political legitimacy internationally, and the other one, which was important to them, was the fact that they basically said, and this is the only guerrilla movement I've heard saying this, is that our children are bad soldiers. They cry for mama at night. They do not walk. Really bad, you know, from there.
And they don't do their homework.
Exactly.
They're like in school, huh? Yeah, they don't learn the perfect irregular verbs.
They don't walk as fast. They can't carry as much.
Right.
So those were arguments that they used.
Yeah.
So they were complaining about that, and then finally they said, "Listen, we've been in war for 50 years. We have." Our children cannot read and write. I can read and write because I'm 40 or 50. I went to, for some reason, he had better opportunities than the present younger generation. And if we don't have a generation that can read and write, then we can continue fighting for another 50 years because we will have nothing to build our country with again. So if you, the international community, are willing to give our kids education, vocational training, all this that they need, then we are willing to make a trade-off. And that's how it started, and that's what they say.
That's very perceptive on their part.
Yeah. But the funny or the interesting thing
so
is
that gives an opening to the world at large doing the right thing for the masses to allow this thing to be undercut. The context within which this thing emerges to undercut. Possibly, if we will but do the right thing.
I think what you're uniquely bringing to this program is the fact that you have talked with these people directly. And so what I'm wondering is, when you talk with others, there are opposite numbers in other countries, do you see those same perceptions of the need to supply an educated base for the new generation to build the country? Or are they so busy just trying to survive from day to day that they just can't get their minds?
It really depends on where you are in a conflict. I mean, conflicts have so many stages in life circles. And in southern Sudan, they are at the very end of the cycle, and hopefully they will even close the peace agreement sometime this coming 2 weeks. So they're really close to an ending. I mean, they were so tired of the war. But I mean, when I just talk to them, I sort of sit and listen. But I also have in my memory the fact that we've been working with this issue with these guys for 10 years, trying to convince them that this is the situation, that this is what the priority should be. And what I'm trying to say here is that the international response in terms of rehabilitation programs, in terms of providing education, demobilizing these child soldiers and so on, it's a process that takes an enormous amount of time. You can't just go into Liberia or the DRC or Colombia and think that over a period of 2 months we will be able to set up this program and convince the warring factions that they should demobilize their kids, and here we are, and solve it for them.
That's going to take at least 3 months.
It took us 10 years. I'm not saying it takes, but I'm just saying these things, and you have to be realistic about these things. And you have to realize that if you want to do it, not only does it take time, but you also need to work with the local communities, with the families living there, with the elders, with the religious leaders,
I hear the need for trained people, and I'm wondering, what do you do about your funder who wants a report next week because their board is meeting and they haven't decided whether to renew your grant or not?
There's that. And it comes back to the question again. It's a large question. It's a large question of whether or not the system that's in place, we've got 6 billion heading for 10 maybe, and we have a system, we have a number of people. The people in Bolivia just said they've had enough of 500 years of a plutocratic class owning and taking advantage of everything like that. And there are many people in the world who see that as the way the world is set up. You have a plutocratic few who do well. They serve each other, and they do not take advantage. They do not have systems in place that are going to be able to deliver elemental justice, is the term, or a development for the mass of the people of the world. And what do you think? Do we have a system in order? Mr. Bush seems to think that he's going to be able to try and do that in the country of Iraq by putting treasury-breaking kinds of tax burdens upon the American people. Do we have a system in place that is going to be able to drain the swamp, as it were, of the injustice and the inequities that exist in the world, if there is a basis for the for the hatreds or for the vehemence of the hatreds and the feelings that penetrate through the generations. Do we have a vision to make this world work? Because there are too many people who tell us the things that are in place are not working, but only serve the well-to-do already, and a little bit trickles down, and it doesn't trickle down, and you have opposition. So that's a macro-political view of the world. What do you think?
It's a wonderful question, and in case that question wasn't enough to break the camel's back, let me add one more straw.
You can add another straw to that
yes,
back?
I will. And that is, how do we do that in such a way as to attract and engage the full efforts, the wholehearted enthusiasm of the population of that country?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And what I'm thinking of is something like, for example, what if they're all shareholders?
Yeah.
In something in a meaningful way,
Yeah.
and not a way that causes, as with some former socialist countries that went
important
through a
as the
charade of this,
Yeah.
where they gave everybody the shares, and then immediately a whole bunch of sharks and fast operators went out through the countryside and bought up all the shares for essentially pennies on the dollar.
That's about what we've done over the historical pattern. It served the really sharp ones at the top, the kings it was, and then we got to be multinational corporations and things. We had a big testing of that here with Enron and the breakdown of our system here. The system that's in place is a plutocratically oriented, support the rich, trickle-down system, and we don't have a system or a vision. They were wrong, they were inappropriate, it was wrong, but Marx did say there were inherent contradictions to capitalism. Well, capitalism has emerged apparently triumphant with the downfall of the Marxist model out of the Soviet Union and so forth, but are the inherent contradictions that he spoke of still there in terms of the legitimacy of the ruling systems in the world that would presume to be able to set a pattern for the world, but the pattern that they're setting is not adequate, so you're going to have rebellion. There was one last thing. There was at the time of when Mr. Bush, for instance, we're talking here in the United States, was going to invade unilaterally Iraq, there was a huge movement all around the world. There was a movement, February 15th, and the New York Times famously said we have two superpowers. We have the United States of America, and we have the rest of the world public opinion, which is against them. Is there a thing coming where the legitimacy of the major powers that be in the context, the macro context which they assume world affairs are going to transpire, are going to be seriously questioned? You've got Lula in Brazil, you've got Chavez in Venezuela, you've got Bolivia now, you've got Ecuador, it's on all the continents and so forth. So some of these rebellions are directed against the macro divide and conquer rules that the neo-colonial pattern of the Western hegemonic powers are establishing in the world. And is that a question that needs to be addressed rather than just assuming we have only to educate them to our pattern and then they will all follow in our pattern, and our pattern is right and appropriate to what the future requires for us to be able to get past the inherent systemic problems that create these kind of conditions all around the world as they seem to be cropping up. Do we have a vision that is adequate?
Just as Henrik brought up the question of what is the international response going to be to problems within a country, for example, and that will have tremendous influence, or can have tremendous influence, on the course that those things take. Similarly, for your question about world public opinion, the question is the mobilization of world public opinion. And what actions will those who hold those opinions be able to take? What actions will they see as being available to them, as worthwhile taking, and as ones that they will actually take? And that's the kind of thing I've been working on, is how do you mobilize opinion and turn it into concrete, tangible action? Because it's the only way that you'll achieve a result. Otherwise, people have opinions. You talk to people in the street, oh yeah, it's terrible, terrible thing. But what are they going to do about it? If they don't do anything, it doesn't change anything.
But Henrik
there has to be mobilization.
Yeah, I think so. And Henrik talks about this thing in Sudan where he said it was a practical thing that they would say it's good for us to do it. We get time on CNN. Those kind of things might be able to be nurtured more in terms of our response to it. I would put that larger context as one that these things could. We have a universal declaration of human rights. We have certain agreed principles in the world, and most people would agree to certain principles. But we have a problem when the people are doing things like cutting off pieces of noses arbitrarily and so forth in the name of some sort of a cause. That's a beyond the
Can you take a crack at what you just said?
I mean, put it this way. I mean, there is. If we try to narrow it down a little bit to issues, what you're talking about really is how can we make sure that the world in the future are not as bad as it is today, and that development is growing and so on. And what I, in a way,
sustainable. And
but let me, but what I think
are we
is
going to make it?
that are we going to make it? It's so. There are, from my point of view, I mean, there are experts on development. The United Nations and the NGOs and governments have, over the years, developed sort of an enormous expertise on how to promote development in developing countries, which is not always, you know, some of them have not been very good, and some of them have been more successful. And of course, it's a matter of learning from your experiences and so on. But in this particular situation. In conflict situations, we have to deal with, on the one hand, situations before a conflict. How do we make sure that prevention programs function?
Ah, man, if it's possible.
This is life cycle.
But I was looking ahead 30 years.
Yeah,
I mean, can we prevent that from
So that is one sort of way of approaching it. Then we have the ongoing conflict, and we need to say, okay, how can we make sure that the warring parties actually stick to international laws and international humanitarian law and the Geneva Conventions and so on.
And do we have agreed to principles?
Yeah. And then we have the post-conflict situation, which is building up countries after wars, after armed conflict. And in a sense, I sort of see that one part of your question relates to that section, that part. I mean, how do we build post-conflict situations or countries so that they can actually prosper and get over their terrible experiences that they often suffer from.
Yeah.
And I think from that regard, I feel fairly comfortable and confident that, for example, those agencies that have been working with this for 50 years have a pretty good knowledge about how to do these things. But the problem is to get funds, to generate support, to be able to engage in the long-term programs that we often talk about, because development are very rarely quick fixes. It's it's 10 years perspectives, it's sometimes longer. And it's always, if you want to be successful, programs that need to rely on local cultures and traditions and value systems that are there, in addition to whatever knowledge sort of the world has in terms of democratic development and market economy and all of this, and so on.
Well, yeah. But he brought up the question of the economics and so that sort of thing. And Karl Marx thought he had an idea, but would cause the problem in terms of the inequities in the world. And he had a notion of the surplus labor theory of value, and that private property was the institution that should be eliminated. This sort of thing. They developed this. And that informed the thinking of a great number of people who were socially conscious in a socialist or a left-wing bent or something like that for a very long time, challenging the system that has emerged now following the implosion of the Soviet Union. You have a thing going on in China, that sort of thing. Do we have a clear, at the economic level, do we have a clear understanding at a theoretical basis of how we're going to go about dealing with the macroeconomic questions of the world? Who is it that's informing world economic from a theoretical perspective? Are we following Schumpeter now? Are we following Van Hayek? Are we following the Chicago School? Is it going to be, is there a dealing with the fact that technology is becoming increasingly responsible for production? Do we have an equitable distribution of ownership rights of the means of production other than just labor? Is the labor theory of value adequate in order to distribute income to the people of the world? Or are we out of sync with something that we need at an intellectual level, a political leadership level, a new vision in how the planet's going to work in terms of evolving new technological ways in which production is being carried out? Or are we just stumbling or bumbling, or what do they call it, muddling through, as the British say, and don't have a clear idea theoretically of what informs our political policy from economic understanding? You've both studied economics. What do you think?
This sounds like the theoretical aspects of this could clearly be not just one other program, but a whole series.
Everything we talk about in conversations could be a whole series.
This is true, but I'm thinking on a very practical level. What I said about it.
I think I don't think we know what we're doing. I mean, at a theoretical level, I don't think we have a clear understanding of what it is that informs it.
Attraction and engagement. If you want to get progress in a country, it would be a nice idea to attract and engage the people of that country to pull in positive, constructive directions. Now, it would seem to me that it would be more in their interest, and they would perceive it as being in their interest to do that if they're going to get some kind of reward for doing that. Either a spiritual reward, a moral or ethical reward, or an economic reward, or hopefully some of all of those. So the question of are the spoils being adequately divided, are the profits being adequately divided?
Are we realizing the growth we could?
I think the world is wrestling with this.
Is there greater justice of income distribution? Do we have a system that's worthy of emulation by the peoples of the world that's being advanced by the leadership, the plutocratic leadership who's running the world? Are they falling down? And behind them, the intellectual leadership providing some sort of an understanding in a macroeconomic sense of what's actually going on.
Keeping this as grounded, keeping it as grounded as possible on a practical level. What I would say is that in any situation you will have people, basically there's a great Brazilian expression, puxando a sardinha para seu lado do prato, which
does that mean?
Which is literally pulling the sardine to your side of the plate.
Oh, I see, right.
And so it's a wonderful idea that when you get people coming to the table, they're coming to the table because they need something from the other people at the table. If they don't need something from the other people at the table, they don't even come to the table. They just make a decision and do whatever they want to do. If they come to the table to discuss something, it's because they need something from someone else. Whatever the theory, one thing you can be sure of is that people are going to tend to try to pull the sardine to their side of the plate. If you have someone who's able to do that all by themselves, they'll just do it. And this is what's been happening with the natural resources in many of the countries that have child soldiers, for example, is that somebody just takes those natural resources and basically the people wind up holding the short end of the stick. They put in a lot of labor for very little reward, usually as little as the people in charge can get away with. Being in charge is enforced by the surreptitious use, the hidden use of military power or quasi-military power, all sorts of shady things, all sorts of things that the world wouldn't approve of if they wound up on the front page of the New York Times, so to speak. And so if they can do that, they will do that. If you want to see a better result, then it would seem to me you need to have people really represented at that table. Other interests of labor, interests of residents, interests of people negatively affected by the external the externalization of costs through pollution, for example. The people who are going to be affected by something have to be meaningfully represented.
I think there are a lot of people who feel they are not represented by the current leadership of the planet. And that there get deep resentments, and that it's only getting worse and will only get worse, and that they don't have some, and I mean, children in armies is totally something that has to be fought. Just trying to get at some sort of an understanding.
But I think one interesting, from a UN perspective.
Yes.
I mean, one of the big challenges that we're facing now.
The UN or the world?
The United Nations as an organization, but the world in general as well, is that what we have to confront today is this concept of globalization.
Yes, exactly.
The concept of globalization has brought many different things on our plate.
Yeah.
But one of the interesting trends in all of that is that what we see is, again, a shift of power. We started talking about that, but coming back to it. And nation states, governments, see that a lot of their former power and influence deteriorate, and they get less of it. On the other side, we see new actors coming up on the sort of global arena, and especially two types of them. One of them are the multinational companies that grow in strength and in political influence, and the other group are networks of a particular organizations that combine experts from governments, from NGOs, from media and others, and those networks are global in their way of structuring, and they are extremely successful in pushing issues forward, especially towards development and so on. And we see in the last 10 years a range of international instruments that have been created because of these networks, and even though they went exactly against the interest of countries like in Europe or America. I mean, I'm thinking about the the landmine, the Convention
That
Against
did get
Landmine.
done.
It went down.
That woman won the Nobel Prize.
And
God bless
yeah,
her,
exactly.
yeah.
Despite the fact that some countries still haven't signed,
Yeah,
Yeah.
and never will, probably.
yeah.
Have we signed?
We
No.
have no.
Very
And-
pointedly.
yeah,
And then we have the International Criminal Court and its
Mhm.
statutes.
Another
Another one that
thorny
the U.S.
issue
hasn't
that
signed.
the
Yeah,
United States has
which was
stood against.
which was
Yeah.
all because I mean a lot of it happened because of the pressure of these networks of NGOs and others who really pushed this forward. We have the child soldiers legislation. It's called the Optional Protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and it raised the minimum age for recruitment and use of child
18.
soldiers from 15 to 18.
And that's been in where?
It was
Where-
blocked for 10 years.
Yeah, but
and
where is that enacted? I mean,
it's
international
it's the
court or
UN. It's
in
the
the
UN. Yeah,
UN
a UN
Security
convention
Council
on the
or-
no in the
No.
General Assembly.
Well, that doesn't have any binding thing or anything. No, okay, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's
No,
a
I
human
understand.
rights treaty
Yeah,
as
it's
such.
right, okay,
It's
right,
not, yeah.
right.
To which
Uh-huh.
the United States is not a signatory.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the United States seems not
The
to want to
signa-
sign on to a lot of these
The-
things.
Well, the United States
Yeah.
recruits at 17, so
Yeah.
they're not going to agree to
Yeah.
something
I don't,
that's
but
at
let's
18.
not,
And then-
he's got a train of thought here, we ought to let him get on.
And then we have the conventions against torture, death penalty, which are similar. Not to mention the ones on the environment,
Mhm.
and those are all because of very strong networks of NGOs pushing issue forward.
And you have people like Alan Dershowitz said we should torture, and we should
Yeah,
torture
yeah.
the people that,
Yeah.
you know, and there are countervailing
Mm.
forces, that's all.
But the interesting thing is that these entities, both the multinational companies and the NGO networks, has a couple of advantages, and one of them being that because of this the possibility to communicate technology, technology and emails and all of this, they have actors and people involved everywhere around the world, and in a matter of seconds they can have precise information about what goes on in Aceh.
They might be able to even see this program.
Exactly.
Because they got the
Yeah,
internet
yeah,
is beginning to link
Yeah.
things together. There may be hope in that, that we
Exactly.
can begin to have a communications capability. I know John's really interested in that, getting computing power around to a lot of people that haven't been having a firm voice. But we only got a few seconds
Yeah,
left. Could you
and
try
to wrap
make
it up, what I'm thinking
Yeah.
is that all this is a reality that we as an international organization like the United Nations has to face. And I don't believe that we can work in the future on issues to confront, development, child soldiers, children in armed conflict, without taking into account that we have to go beyond governments, beyond states,
right. and get to a comprehensive understanding.
yeah,
of things.
and start working much more closely with civil society, NGOs, both at global level, but most importantly, in the field where the things are happening.
Well, you've been working in the field, and I congratulate you on that work
Thank
very
you.
much.
Thank you
Thanks
so
for coming,
much.
John. It's good to
Thank
see
you.
Sorry, we could go on talking for about 15, 16 hours, but we've run out of time for this program. It's been your pleasure to have the Perceptions. On my far left, John German. He's president of a non-profit computing, doing great work in terms of getting computing power into some of the hands of the people that have things to communicate, that they have a challenge. And on my immediate left is Henrik Haggstrom, and he's with the office here of the United Nations, looking out for the interests of children, trying to steer us away from using children in such horrible conditions. Thank you for all the work you've been doing, for coming in and sharing the perception. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
We'll be coming back again next week. That's it for this particular program. Thanks for viewing. We'll be coming back, and please tune in, and then until next time. So unfortunately, we run out of time. That happens. But and it's such a big subject.
Did we get everything?
No, I'm not sure. We're just chatting now, and so I'm not sure until because I got some sort of thing. I'm not sure. So there's a lot of things we could have gone into, but maybe we should do. Are you in New York on a steady basis now? Okay, well, maybe we could be in touch with one another,
yeah.
and maybe people over at the UN could become aware of the fact that there is this access thing. They communicate. I don't know how.